What is everybody? Welcome back to the Optimal presented by FTN Daily. Back again with some more MLB DFS talk. Going to be running through the top stacks and top pitchers of the day. A little early in the day here, and obviously a lot of news is going to be impacting the MLB slate with weather. Yeah, I think this was a 12 or 13 game slate to start. We've already had 2 or 3 games rained out and some others that are going to be impacted by rain. So make sure you are staying up to date with the weather and the rain as much as possible. Obviously, games being rained out are going to take people out of consideration in general, but for pitchers, if they, get hit by a delay, their day could easily be done. So make sure you are staying as up to date as possible on that news. And obviously in the FTN Daily Discord, we'll be running through on how we're going to be approaching the lineups based on the weather and how, we'll be playing the situations out. But let's hop into the Optimizer here and let's talk some top pitchers of the day. Up at the top, we have Shane Bieber, Yu Darvish, Kevin Gausman. In terms of pricing, and we are looking at FanDuel today. We looked at DraftKings the other day, so we're going to head over to FanDuel for this one here. Gausman is the most expensive pitcher on the board, rightfully so. The guy's been completely electric so far this season. He was very good the last year and a half as well as a Giant, but getting that big contract in Toronto and being expected to fill the shoes of Robbie Ray, who won a Cy Young last year. He's doing a very good job of that so far this season. He's arguably been the best pitcher in baseball so far this year. There's a lot of really strong candidates, but when you consider some guys have been dealing with injury, DeGrom hasn't even pitched yet this season. He's been up there, right? So far this season, 34% strikeout rate, 2.2 xFIP. Hasn't given up a home run or a walk yet this year, which I think is actually an absurd number. And I think the most impressive thing about Gausman is he's doing all of that, and the matchups have been very difficult. He's faced Boston twice, he's faced New York, and he's faced Houston. So, I would say 4 out of his 5 matchups, and then even the Texas team on opening day, I would say all 5 of those teams are above average offenses. Maybe Texas has been a little bit underperforming, but Houston, Boston, New York, all above average teams. He has 4 straight starts against Houston, Boston again, and then New York, all with 8 or more strikeouts. And like I mentioned, hasn't given up a walk yet. Hasn't given up a home run. So he's been phenomenal, right? He's going deep into games already, and all of his breaking stuff is working fantastically. And he's just been, in general, very good. I think it's a matchup here against the Indians, who don't strike out a whole lot. When you're looking at this team, looking at their numbers over the last 2 seasons, you only have 3 guys in this lineup with a 22% strikeout rate or higher. You have Framber Reyes at 35, Jimenez at 26, and Hedges at 27. That's the projected lineup. And then you have a lot of low strikeout guys. Ramirez, Josh Naylor's been a low strikeout guy. Stephen Kwan, who's been very good as a rookie so far this season, he's a low strikeout guy. And then I guess we can see how they're going to round out their lineup. But if it looks like Miles Straw is in the lineup, he's a low strikeout guy as well. So I have no problem with Gausman. I do think that he's a fairly safe option. This Cleveland lineup doesn't necessarily give you a whole lot to be scared of in terms of power. There's maybe 3 bats: Ramirez, Framber Reyes, and Stephen Kwan, who does have a 217 ISO so far this season against righties, so that's worth noting. But outside of that, there's just not a lot of power. You have 4 guys in the lineup with a sub 115 ISO projected lineup, I should say. So it's just a really bad lineup with not a lot of power, but you do have 3 or 4 hitters who can get the job done. And again, not a lot of guys who are striking out. So Gausman, I think, is totally fine just because of how good he is. And again, when you're that good of a pitcher with such a high strikeout rate like Gausman has, you don't necessarily need the help from a matchup because you can just get it done on your own. But it never hurts, right? And then you're gonna have some other guys on this slate who are very good pitchers as well, who have good matchups. Speaking of, you have Shane Bieber in this game. I don't want to call this a very good matchup, and it's arguably pretty similar in terms of a strikeout percentage standpoint as Gausman, but there are more bats in this lineup with significant strikeout rates. So far this season, you have 4 hitters in this Toronto lineup striking out 24% of the time or more. You only have 2 hitters in the lineup who have a 20% or less strikeout rate so far this season against righties. Obviously, we know they're dealing with some injuries. Does sound like they can get Teoscar Hernandez back, which would go a long way, and making this lineup a bit scarier. But still, it's Shane Bieber, right? And his strikeout numbers have not been great this year. He's at about 25% strikeout rate, where he was at 33% last season. But just in terms of the overall talent that Bieber has, and even more appealing is the price tag, right? He's the third most expensive pitcher on the board on FanDuel. It's only 8,700 on DraftKings. Those are really interesting prices there. So sure, the matchup's not great, but the price is pretty nice for Shane Bieber on both sides. Darvish is pretty interesting. We saw what Nick Martinez did to this Miami team last night. There is a lot of very, very undisciplined hitters in this Miami lineup here. You have Jazz Chisholm, who's probably the team's best hitter, and he's pretty undisciplined as well, 27% strikeout rate. His walk rate is pretty high at about 10%, so that's kind of evens things out a little bit so far this season, but still striking out a ton. You have Jorge Solaire, who has just looked absolutely terrible, much exclusively as a man. He's percent strike. Woba been very, very. He's hitting for this team. You have Jesus Sanchez, who's a very good hitter and has a ton of power, but also strikes out a ton, 28%. He's kind of trending in the direction of a guy who showed a ton of power, a ton of pop, and just overall being a very good hitter. But looks like teams are sort of figuring him out a bit, which is a bit scary if you're Jesus Sanchez. But again, I think he's a good enough hitter to still be a fear spot in the lineup. But if he's going to strike out a ton, all things considered, kind of evens out. You take away Jazz Chisholm and Jesus Sanchez, there's nobody else in this lineup with any sort of power against righties so far this season. You have no hitters in the lineup with a ISO above 150, and you have 6 names under 110 ISO. Jesus Aguilar is included in that. He's been hitting decently well against lefties over the course of his career. Hasn't had much success really at all this year with just power in general. I know he homered a couple days ago, but the power hasn't really been there for Aguilar, who only has 2 home runs on the year. He's probably their third best hitter, but just in terms of the guys after that, you have Garrett Cooper, who has a 103 ISO, 23% strikeout rate. Avisail Garcia, who they signed hoping that he would be a big bat in the middle of the order, has been terrible this year. He's arguably been worse than Jorge Solaire. 0.046 ISO, 207 WOBA, 30% strikeout rate. I don't know if it's arguable, actually. I think he's just been, bottom line, way worse against righties than Jorge Solaire, because obviously Garcia also only has a 3% walk rate. At least Solaire is getting on base via the walk 10% of the time. So Garcia was supposed to be a big problem bat in this lineup, and this year he's just been downright awful against righties. And again, you're still dealing with small sample stuff, so guys like Solaire and Garcia and Aguilar and maybe even Garrett Cooper a little bit could get better, but it's still a lineup that I think Darvish can take advantage of. When you're looking at the numbers dating back to last season, only 2 hitters under 20% strikeout rates, and that's Jesus Aguilar and Miguel Rojas. Then you have 5 hitters with a 24% strikeout rate or higher. So plenty of ways for Darvish to get it done. He would be my favorite option up at the top as of now, I think. I think he has a nice mix of a safe matchup as well as a high upside matchup. I think he's actually the worst pitcher of these 3. That's not saying he's a bad pitcher by any means. It hasn't been the cleanest start for him so far this season. But again, I think this is a good spot for him to get back on track. No offense to the Marlins, but Nick Martinez was, essentially exiled from the MLB, went overseas for a few years. He came back and threw an absolute gem against them last night. I have no doubt that Darvish can, do something similar. And he's actually coming off of 3 pretty solid starts here, where he's had 5 or more strikeouts in the last 3. He did give up 3 runs to Pittsburgh last time out, which was not ideal. But in his 2 starts prior to that, it was against the Dodgers and the Braves. He struck out 15 total batters, only gave up 1 run and only 5 hits in about 12 2/3 innings pitched against 2 of the best offenses, if not the 2 best offenses in baseball. So he's had a couple of rocky starts. He got absolutely lit up against the Giants in his second start of the year, where he gave up 9 runs in just 1 2/3 innings. So obviously those numbers are going to absolutely nuke all of your season-long numbers when you've only made 5 starts. But those 2 starts against LA and Atlanta, that was vintage Darvish, right? That's what you're going to get out of him most nights, and obviously a much easier matchup now here against the Miami Marlins. So now you have a couple of names here that on FanDuel, their prices are kind of, I don't want to say completely ugly, but like Eric Lauer, for example, probably not playing him on either side. He's actually the most expensive DraftKings pitcher on the board, which is wild to me. In a matchup against Atlanta, he's 300 cheaper than Shane Bieber, 200 more expensive than Logan Gilbert. So there's probably little to no chance that I go to Eric Lauer today on this slate. I do think that Logan Gilbert is fairly interesting. This Tampa Bay team has been striking out quite a bit, especially over the course of the last year and a half. But when you're looking at Logan Gilbert from a individual pitcher perspective, guy who we know has strong risk reward type prototypes, right? It's a lot of strikeout upside, also gives up a ton of power, which that could go very poorly in a matchup like this against a lineup with guys like Wander Franco and Brandon Lau and Randy Rosarina. But when you're looking at some of these numbers against righties, it's not even just this season, really, but also dating back to last season. Wander Franco, not really all that great against righties. He's been a lot better against left-handed pitching. Same for Yandy Diaz. Same for Randy Rosarina. The big threat in this lineup against righties is Brandon Lau. You have Brett Phillips down at the bottom of the order, who also shows a ton of power, which is surprising against righties. 267 ISO since the start of last season, but a 35% strikeout rate. So there's a lot of strikeouts to be had in this lineup. You have 5 hitters in the lineup with a 25% strikeout rate or higher. Again, projected lineup. You have a couple of guys who are very low strikeout guys, Yandy Diaz, Wander Franco, even Manny Margot down there. But Diaz and Margot specifically don't have a lot of power against righties. Wander Franco can definitely still get it done against righties. Definitely a guy I'm always going to be afraid of. But outside of that, a lot of strikeouts to be had in this lineup. So I think Logan Gilbert is a very interesting risk-reward type play. But in general, I would probably rank the top 3, Darvish, Bieber, and then Kevin Gausman. Bieber might get the slight edge just because he is so much cheaper than someone like Gausman, but when comparing him to Darvish, the $400 difference, that's not going to make a major difference in the lineup. I do think I prefer Darvish as a safety option, but again, I think that Bieber, his upside's massive on any slate, right? And I think we're just waiting for Bieber to continue to kind of round into that form. We're looking at the value options. Bieber's right up there in terms of point per dollar, but Josh Winder's a guy that I think is pretty interesting. He's popping a lot in the projections because of some small sample, high strikeout performances. 7 strikeouts in 6 innings in his only start so far this season. But it's a fantastic matchup, and you're not using him on FanDuel. I don't think, in my opinion, you should be considering him all too much. But on DraftKings as a punt option, that's probably more so where he's in play over there. On FanDuel, though, I think in terms of guys that I'm actively targeting, the only other name that I think I'll be considering as like a core type play is Nathan Evaldi. He's only 8,500 on today's slate. That's fairly appealing. It's $1,000, over $1,000 cheaper than Shane Bieber. The only thing about Evaldi is I sort of feel that you're playing him essentially strictly just for the price tag, because his matchup is not that great either. It's one that you have a ton of bats that you're definitely afraid of. You have Abreu, who's been really bad this year, but he just hit a home run a couple days ago. Maybe he's getting it going. Just in general, there's just no strikeouts in the lineup. Like all these, you're looking at a White Sox lineup they're very similar to the Rangers, where they're all at the same time performing terribly, right? So it's going to turn around eventually. I know you're missing some guys in this lineup. No Eloy Jimenez, so that's obviously a big bat to miss. But you still have some pretty big bats in Abreu, Tim Anderson, Luis Robert, Yasmani Grandal, AJ Pollock, Gavin Sheets. They're a team that is much better against lefties, and even against lefties, they've been struggling so far this season. So it's kind of like you're just waiting for them to turn around. But even with the lack of power and really just lack of production you're getting across the board from these guys, they're still not a whole lot. Only one outside of that, we're talking a ton of low strikeout guys so far this season. Then when you look at dating back to last year as well, only one hitter again over 22%, and that's Jose Abreu in terms of strikeout rates. So not a lot of strikeouts to be had in this lineup, and it also does feel like it's a team that's going to turn around. But I do like Evaldi as a pitcher. I think he's a really, really solid pitcher, and he's cheap, so he's in play from that perspective. But let's talk about some top stacks here. We're gonna head over to the stacking model here, and again, update this every single day with my stacking model. Basically, it's just you have a couple different metrics on here. I know I've broken it down a couple of times, but essentially what the stack rating is, it's like an all-encompassing number of a ton of different stats and projections and all that stuff. And then the power rater over here is how likely a pitcher is to give up power in a specific instance in that matchup, right? And then the projected team total. So maybe I should add the Vegas implied team total, but this is my projected team total, which is typically not that far off from Vegas anyway. But you have Houston up at the top. Bo Breesk, I think his name is. He's a guy who's basically just making spot starts for guys who have been injured, like Casey Mize, Matt Manning, all those guys who have been kind of dealing with some injuries. Spencer Turnbull as well. That's the reason why he's getting these starts, and he's actually, to be honest, he's actually looked fine throughout the starts. Like in terms of just looking at how he's produced, he's had not very easy matchups. He was on the road against the Dodgers, only gave up one run there, and then against Colorado, which isn't the easiest matchup either, he gave up 3 runs. Doesn't appear to be a high strikeout guy. Doesn't appear to be an explosive arm, and that's typically going to get you in trouble, especially against really good teams like the Astros, who are getting healthier and healthier. You have Altuve back in the lineup, and he's homered, I think, in 2 of his first 3 games. Yeah, home runs in 2 of his first 3 games back. 2 of his last 4 games since returning from the injury. But he homered last night against Detroit. He appears to be kind of heating up a little bit more. You got Brantley in the 2 hole, not a ton of power, but a very strong contact hitter, 363 WOBA. You have Bregman, who's better against lefties, but still a bat to be afraid of and doesn't strike out a whole lot against righties. Alvarez, Tucker, Gurriel. It's the kind of typical Astros team that you're seeing kind of get healthy now. They still have some guys on their bench that they can roll out as well, I guess, and make the lineup a bit scarier. Like if they rolled out Castro over Maldonado, he's probably a better hitter against right-handed hitting. But just in general, the big bats, mainly Tucker, Alvarez, Altuve, Bregman. Jeremy Pena has been fantastic. I totally underestimated the amount of power this guy was going to have. He has a ton of power in his bat so far this season, not only against lefties, but against righties as well. 258 ISO against righties and 70 at-bats against righties. So this Houston team is just stacked top to bottom, so that's kind of where the interest, I shouldn't say top to bottom, but they have a very strong lineup. So they're a very interesting team against a guy who I don't think is going to be any sort of elite pitcher or anything like that. Second on the board, you have the Angels, who I also think are a pretty interesting stack here. Going against Joan Adon here. High walk rate, not a super low strikeout rate, 22%, but not very high either. Fairly small sample. He's only faced about 130 hitters so far this season. 111 hitters so far this season, but since the start of last year, about 130 hitters. But the ground ball rate, not overly high. The hard contact rate is extremely high. He has a very low swing strike rate, only 8%. So not expecting this guy to have a ton of swing and miss stuff. And now you're talking about a Angels lineup who has potentially the most surprisingly impressive player in the MLB so far from a hitting perspective, and Taylor Ward. Obviously, you have Mike Trout and Ohtani, you never have to talk about. But you also have Jared Walsh, who was slumping quite a bit to start the year, and has now 8 RBIs in 2 games against Boston, back-to-back home runs, or back-to-back games with home runs, I should say, with 4 RBIs in each of those games against Boston in the last 2 times out. So Walsh, Ohtani, Trout, even Brandon Marsh, who has a ton of speed, a ton of stolen base upside, and a little bit of pop as well. You have Ward, all those guys. I didn't even mention Anthony Rendon, who has been pretty bad against righties so far this season, but still a big bat in the middle of the order there. So Angels I like at number 2. I think it's Baltimore at number 3 here. Another team that's got some bats in the lineup heating up here. We saw Mountcastle hit 2 home runs last night, I believe it was. And then you saw Cedric Mullins. I think he has home runs in back-to-back games now. Yep. Now, obviously, we know Cedric Mullins can rack up tons of points without necessarily needing a ton of power. One thing I noticed about Carlos Hernandez here, he's been very good against lefties, and that's somewhat of a problem for a guy like Cedric Mullins. But Cedric Mullins is very, very good against right-handed pitching, and he just doesn't strike anybody out. And last year, at times when Hernandez was getting the job done, it was because he was doing a better job at generating some swings and misses. 11% strikeout swing strike rate last season, down to 10% this year. So far this season, he has a 9.5% strikeout rate and a 12% walk rate. Those kinds of numbers just are not going to get you through many MLB games. So in terms of guys I do tend to lean towards liking righties more. It's just you have a more sustained sample of Hernandez struggling against righties. But again, Cedric Mullins, even Anthony Santander, love those guys here. Mountcastle, Mancini, who I know has been very bad this season against righties, but he's from a career basis, he's probably their best hitter, definitely one of them. But still like Mullins, even though Hernandez has been decent against lefties at preventing the power. But basically 1 through 5 in this Baltimore order I like. So those are the top 3 stacks for me of the day. A couple other options I like. I love Boston. I'm interested to see where their ownership comes in. Vince Velasquez has been very, very bad. San Francisco against Jordan Hicks. Hicks won't likely be on the mound all that long. Hicks is very good, a pitcher who I like a ton, and I'm interested to see what kind of path they take this guy down. He was their closer at one point. Now he's starting and only typically throwing 2 or 3 innings. So far this season, his strikeout rate is at 26% with a ground ball rate of 64%. Not numbers that you typically see, but very small sample. He's only faced 50 hitters. Very high walk rate, though. Not the most controlled pitcher. So I'm curious to see where they take him in terms of his overall path. But again, San Francisco, pretty good lineup, and we're going to see a long reliever behind him. So that's likely not going to be as good as Jordan Hicks is. So keep that in mind. But those are going to be it for the top 5 stacks or so of the day. So there you have it. Top pitchers, top stacks broken down. As always, stay tuned for the content coming to the site. Make sure you guys are staying up to date on those confirmed and starting lineups, the official lineups. Obviously, a lot of the projections and stuff are working off of projected lineups. So make sure you're getting those confirmed lineups before submitting your lineups, and also checking in on the updated weather every day, but especially today where there's a lot of weather in the forecast. But that's going to do it for us. Appreciate you guys tuning in. We will see you guys next week. Hopefully you all have a great weekend. Looks like if you're on the East Coast like me, you're finally getting, or I guess in the Midwest, you're finally getting some sunshine. So hopefully you can enjoy that. We will see you guys next week. And as always, good luck, everybody.